Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. One of the great pleasures of being an English teacher, I think, is to be able to read widely and be able to recommend writers you've really enjoyed to the pupils that you teach, and hope that they will also be inspired by those writers. I'm no longer a teacher. I work for WJEC Eduqas. We're one of the sponsors of this conference, so I can't recommend those writers to pupils anymore. But because we're one of the sponsors, I can recommend them to NATE conference delegates. And it's a real pleasure to introduce one of those writers to you this afternoon. We've got Tessa Hadley with us, who has a short story regularly published in The New Yorker, which is a sort of mark of quality in itself. And her 6 novels have all been published to great acclaim, and we're very privileged to have her with us here today. She's been called one of English's finest contemporary writers, and we're really pleased to have her with us. I'm sure you want to welcome her with me with a round of applause. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's very lovely to be here. Can you all hear me okay? So I'm going to start with a bit of reading. And before I read anything of my own, I don't know, it's a strange night last night, and there may be a few enthusiastic Brexiteers in the audience, but my feeling is quite a lot of you will be wondering what murky path, what new place we're travelling to today and in our future. And I've got this lovely little piece of writing about writing that it's not mine. It's by a Belgian novelist who I'm a huge fan of, called Jean-Philippe Toussaint. And strangely, this book of his is about football, and I bought it for my husband, who's sitting at the back. But it's got this, lots of it's about goals and watching World Cup, but it's got this lovely bit about why writing matters. And somehow this morning after last night, it felt right. I felt I wanted to begin with that. It's a very sort of heartfelt declaration, and I'm English, so I would probably keep that back. But he's Belgian and he's writing in French, so he puts it right out there eloquently, and I thought I would share it with you. And it begins, Brazil 2014. I went through some difficult times in early 2014. My father died in December 2013, and knew I had just completed a sequence of novels that had kept me busy for over 10 years. A cycle was coming to an end, leaving me empty and lost. I experienced a crisis, a fleeting moment of doubt, uncertainty, and dejection, which led me to inquire into the meaning of my life and my commitment to literature. What does it mean to create today in the world we live in? It means proposing now and again an act of resistance that is not modest but minor, a signal, a book, a work of art, which will send out a faint, vain, and wanton light into the night. I had been revolving for several months around this idea, this inquiry, these questions. What I was doing in stubbornly pursuing my work as a writer for 30 years was simply forcing myself to assert a possible human path, a way, an attitude, a delicacy, a subtlety, a gentleness, a dignity, which in terms of immediate advantages, glory, money, fame, in short, everything that weighs down on even the least significant football star, mightn't bring me much, but which would serve as an example to my children, and through them to future generations, to the human race as a whole. In spite of the difficulties, in spite of the harshness of the task, I had to persevere, not deviate from my path, stay away from the hubbub and agitation of the world. Not that I reject light or fear it, but in order to create, I need shadow silence, and solitude. You can see what I mean about we British don't talk like that about our art. She's the one. The winter after her brother killed himself, Ali got a job at a writer's centre near her parents' house, helping out with admin in the office. It wasn't a satisfactory job, only part-time and not well paid. She was 22. She had just finished her degree in English literature and should have been building towards some sort of career. She had planned to move to Manchester, where she had been at university. But everything like that had to be put on hold, while at home, her family melted down into a kind of madness. It was a relief just to leave the madness behind and drive across the moors 4 mornings a week to the centre several miles away. She had the use of a car because, for the moment, her mum wasn't going to work. The moors that winter were often under a crust of snow, not enough to blanket them in white, but a mean, dirty frosting on the hard earth and wilted shrubs. Ali didn't mind the bitter weather. Her guilt at getting out even for a few hours would fall away as she drove, leaving the town behind. Sometimes when she parked at the centre, crunching into the gravelled space between the kitchen and the high black garden wall, where the stones were mossy and ferns grew in the cracks, she was really all right for a moment. I'm really all right, she would think, carefully, lightly, as she pulled the key from the ignition, trying not to examine the sensation too closely or lose it with any sudden movement, as if it were a thin, filmed, shiny bubble poised in her chest. The centre was in a big, bleak house built in the early 19th century, isolated in a dip in the middle of the moors beside a river. It had been modernised to suit its new function. A couple of outbuildings along from the kitchen had been converted into a studio for writing, and an office, homely with comfortable ticking of computers and photocopier and fax machine. Fluorescent post-it notes were stuck to the office shelves, reminding the staff of things that needed doing, the set procedures for each group of students that came and went. Ali quickly mastered all these. She was capable and sensible. The organisers of the centre, Kit and Sam, were pleased to have her helping out. Also, because Ali had always loved reading, the idea was that she would enjoy meeting the writers who taught there. There would be something in it for her too. Ali had got the job through the woman her mum had worked for as a secretary when she was still at work. This woman was a barrister in employment law, and she was on the board of trustees for the centre. In some people, the family's disaster had produced this phenomenon, a crazy energy of organisation on their behalf. Ali was grateful for the job, but it made her mother angry. As usual, she comes barging in, thinking she knows best. Mum was also angry, on the other hand, at their neighbours in the close of ex-council houses, some of whom had been her friends for years, but now kept in and out, trying to avoid meeting her. What were they supposed to say after the first few heartfelt encounters? Hilda came to the centre for a week-long fiction writing course. She was one of those students you learn to pick out at the first encounter as a potential flashpoint, someone who might be easily offended or offend others. You treated such students with special consideration that kept them at arm's length. She was Canadian, probably in her mid-50s, small, with thick, perfectly white hair chopped off in a crisp line at her shoulders. She was a vegan and had requested special dietary arrangements in advance. When everyone gathered around the wood stove in the drawing room of the old house for introductions, Hilda chose to sit cross-legged and straight-backed on the floor, her slight, neat body supple like a child's. She must have been good-looking when she was younger, with Scandinavian features, wide mouth and hard cheekbones, something raw in her eyes, their hazel irises flecked with darker brown, and she fixed the tutors while they were talking with a steady, critical, attentive gaze. Although Ali loved books, she had realised since she began working at the centre that she didn't have much interest in knowing how they were written, how characters were developed or plots structured, or any of the other things the teachers held forth about and the students soaked up so avidly. All of them, writers and would-be writers, were consumed with a sort of fever over this process of writing and being published. Some of the would-bes seemed to hope that by rubbing up close enough against the published ones, they might catch something. That week, it was her turn to take the tutors into town for the mid-course lunch. Anne said that she liked Hilda. She'd had an interesting life. But Frank, who was from Glasgow, tall and loose-bodied with a bald patch like a monk's tonsure, complained that she was wearing him down with her persistence. She stuck to my elbow whenever I looked down, asking whether I've read her rewrites yet or what I think of Robertson Davies. She's so intense. Intense isn't a bad thing. What's her novel about? Ali asked. In the 60s, she hung around with arty types in some sort of commune. The central character has an affair with a rock star. It ought to be more interesting. How many Canadian rock stars do you know? They could only think of Robbie Robertson. They decided it wasn't him. She does this awful folksy thing. He's called the guitar player. The guitar player did this. The guitar player sent out his lonely song into the night across the lake. There's too much nature in it. One tree will do as far as I'm concerned. One tree can stand in for the whole caboodle. Some of the writers who came to tutor the courses were nice, but not all of them were. Some were funny about the students, especially the crazies, the ones who brought the 2,000 handwritten pages of their novel in a plastic bag or wrote from the perspective of a donkey abused by its owner. These eccentrics might turn out to be geniuses, but usually didn't. Ali wasn't disappointed in the writers. She hadn't expected anything from them in the first place. It hadn't occurred to her to be interested in writers as individuals beyond their work. To her relief, no one whose books she'd read ever came to the centre, though sometimes she did have to pretend she'd read the writers who did. The writers could be fairly crazy too. You had to be vigilant not to trip up over their vanity and anxiety. Luckily, most of her favourites were dead.
How did your own experience, thinking of back when you were in school, did that experience at all help you to become a writer later on?
Of course, yes. Right from the very beginning, I think, I have these lovely memories of my junior school teacher, who was a Welshman, and this is in the 1960s. And one of the things that's so present to me that I can conjure it up is that he used to set us every week. I'm sure this doesn't go on in junior schools now. We had to write 5 sentences with the speech marks at the beginning and 5 with the speech marks at the end and 5 with interrupted by he said or she said in the middle, 1 at each end. I now don't use speech marks in my writing, so I don't know whether that says anything about it, but I loved this opportunity. So at that time, I was reading all kinds of extraordinary Victorian novels at home, East Lynne and Lady Audley's Secret, and I kind of used this exercise to write these amazing sentences. I still have a couple of books of them now. So they would say things like, "Will you forgive me for what I did?" she cried, nestling her fair head against his shoulder. What my teacher made of these extraordinary sentences, which were meant to be, "Where is the bull?" said John. But, so that, I can remember the thrill and the power of it now. That was lovely. That was a kind of freedom.
And did the reading, did that also come from school experience, or was that from somewhere else?
We went to the library every week in a little crocodile down to the public library around the corner in Bristol from where I grew up, and all took out books. Every single child in the class took home 3 books from the library, brought them back again the following week. So yeah, I didn't own many books. Kids just didn't then. Even you know, I was encouraged at home. We had books around, but I didn't have shelves full of them. Mostly it was library books. But those Victorian books, I think I had from my grandmother. And when you're little, marvellously, you don't read thinking, this is contemporary. This is my world. That's from the past. That was then. I think I felt the past was completely touching up against where I was. And so I read also children's books from the past, like The Secret Garden and more by her, and The Would-Be-Goods and all the E. Nesbits, without it occurring to me that there were no nannies or nursemaids or cooks or people wearing long dresses in my world. I just felt like it was next door, and that's very precious.
Yeah. In terms of writers who've influenced you, who are the... I mean, are they still influencing the way you write, or are there other writers?
Well, I hope I don't, I don't sound like East Lynne anymore. It's all a great mulch, isn't it? When everything you read is adding in, everything you read and like, and that matters, including some of the things that later you become more sophisticated, you wince at a little, but it doesn't matter. The excitement of the initial encounter goes into your writing self and fertilizes it and nourishes it. And then there's something different that happens, because actually for years, leaping right forwards now, in my 20s and 30s, I was writing but not very well and not getting published. And I'm sure that was because I was trying to write like some of those models from the past, and I hadn't quite found my way through to a contemporary voice. And then I had one or two people I read who did that for me, sort of all at once. Maybe they were Nadine Gordimer, the South African novelist. I remember the revelation of her books and stories. A bit misleading, because I felt like, nothing in British political life quite matched the struggle against apartheid. There is one now completely on the scrap heap novel that I wrote about the miners' strike in 1984. Very much best. I'm so glad that it's gone back to the earth where it belongs. And then Alice Munro, the Canadian short story writer, very important to me. Maybe partly because, in one sense, Munro makes her stories out of so little, what looks ostensibly like so little twists and turns of the domestic and the daily. And I thought, these are huge stories, but they're sort of about small things.
Yeah. You taught at a comprehensive school yourself later on, after graduating. What was that experience like, teaching?
It was terrible. I was completely hopeless at it. And I think I know why. I mean, I think actually writers are really selfish. You know that thing that Toussaint says about needing to go and find that space and that solitude. And I hadn't taken on, as I prepared to teach, quite how total the demand is. And I have never lost my completely heartfelt just wonder at people who do it day in, day out. It's exhausting and exacting, and it's a performance all day long. I do teaching now, but it's so much easier. I don't ever do a day like that, and it's with students who are sort of eager to be in the room. So I was completely hopeless. I love the idea of teaching secondary school kids, but they ran rings round me. I have a memory of myself in the drama studio with all the lights off. Other teachers had neglected to tell me there was a master switch upstairs, shouting into the dark at these hurtling bodies. But I have two lovely memories of that time. So I know from my husband as well, who was a very, very good English school teacher. But I know, even from my own experience, though not to my credit at all, what is possible. One of the memories, I had one first-year class that for some reason I had conned into believing that I was authoritative. They just didn't see through me, and I had a lovely time with them. And I had these two little boys who were hopeless spellers and messy on the page, and you could see they were not going anywhere. And yet they were so imaginative. And we did this work on the story from the Iliad, where Achilles is refusing to fight, and and Patroclus goes to fight the Trojans in his place, and Patroclus's horses look round and they warn him in voices, they speak to him and they tell him he's going to die. And these little boys, you know, wrote this piece of drama, this dramatized version of that, and it was so exquisitely right. You know how very innocent writers can, because they are not pretending anything. It was so authentic, so well judged. That was a beautiful thing. And lots of other good work from that class. And then another great moment, which was with Wayne Powell, who you know, it's a friend of mine, works for WJEC, and I think it was after they took the fourth year class away from me, actually. And I sat with him in a room with about 7 completely wild boys who really had been pulled out from ordinary lessons because people couldn't control them. And Wayne was brilliant with them. And I read to them. And a beautiful book called When the Legends Die by Hal Borland. I don't know if that's ever still read to kids. And just seeing that these boys who no school discipline could reach them, but this enchanting, serious, complicated novel kept them motionless and spellbound. They didn't want it to stop. So I know that that's possible, but it's so hard to get to the point where you can do that, and so I'm so full of admiration.
Yeah,
for
it's one of the great
teachers.
privileges of teaching when it does happen. But you're still teaching. You're teaching now.
Yeah.
You're a professor of creative writing
Yeah.
at Bath Spa University. You've got a different type of student in front of you who wants to learn. But teaching creative writing, where do you start? What do you do with them?
Well, two places, I suppose, really. One of them is that you keep on, as ever, talking about reading, because all writing starts with reading. If ever you hear a student, no, you don't hear this among the MA students I teach, but I have sometimes heard undergraduates sort of say, oh no, I don't read much, I want to do my own stuff. It's incomprehensible and they will never be any good, because writing begins with reading, and you can only learn to write from reading, studying. So there are lovely classes I have where, let's say we do a short story course, and we just look at these short stories and we interrogate them just slightly differently from what an English literature class would do, because we ask questions like, why did the writer do it that way? How did he get away with that? Why did he stop there? We're asking, as a writer, those pragmatic questions, but the funny thing is they unlock the meaning and the tone and the texture of the writing, well, better, I think, actually, than some of those sort of more theoretical questionings that literature does. So that's one thing. But the other thing is we start from their work, of course. The students on the MA course all bring along what they're doing. And there are no rules, there's no toolkit, there's nothing you can teach people that will enable them to write a good novel. But what you do is you say, oh, let's look at this novel. Okay, you've started in the wrong place. That's really good, that bit there, but here it's gone. So it's a very hands-on, very piece by piece, very individual kind of teaching and learning. A luxury, really, a great luxury.
Yeah. It may be difficult to break it down, but here with teachers, thinking about teaching pupils in the classroom to write. For you with those students, what are the key things you want them to have by the end of the time they're with you?
I think, clarity. Absolutely say what you want to say and make sure the reader gets it. So many writers think that getting better at writing means getting more obscure and less clear, and it's the opposite. Always be clear and be truthful. Don't lie. That sounds like a simple command, but of course it's the most difficult one of all. Don't borrow somebody else's cliche or shortcut. Tell the truth about that moment. That, all right, it's a paradoxical thing to ask because the moment doesn't exist. You're making it up. But at the same time, it does have a truth. You have to find your way through to the truth of that moment and tell it simply and clearly.
Just in terms of your own writing, coming back to that, and thinking about that truth, where does the story begin with where does it begin? Does it begin with a plot? Does it begin with a moment or an idea, a character? Where does it begin for you?
Probably with a plot and a character, which sounds so elementary, doesn't it? But I actually do think stories are at the root of humanness, and at the root of stories, there is a somebody to whom something happens, and that's where you begin. And that's when I have a short story idea, a moment, that's how it comes, sort of that person, and then that hits them. Or they fall down that hole. This girl with her brother's suicide. I don't know where that came from. Where does that stuff come from? I don't know. It doesn't come from, you know, it sometimes comes from personal experience, but often not. It's amazing if one is that kind of dangerous dreamer that writers really are. It's a very strange thing. You do have this facility for making up stuff that hasn't happened to you, but it feels immediately as if it has. And you know the things you can't do. You know straight away. I'll never be able to write that. I have no idea what that's like.
So to write in a particular voice or as a particular character?
Yeah. It's funny, in a novel, or maybe in a story, but it really shows up in a novel, what you often get is, say in my latest novel, The Past, there's a group of people gathered together in a house for 3 weeks, and there are some of them I knew from the beginning I would go inside their heads, we'd live inside them, we'd be them, I could do them, I knew them. And then I knew that one person in particular was completely unfathomable. That was her power, in fact, over everybody else around her, was that none of them could get inside her, and I couldn't either. And I would have failed if I'd tried to write her. She would have come over as fake, but instead, very effective to do it like this. You just have everybody else watch her and see her, and you have her move and speak, but she remains, as it were, sort of closed. You can't get through to her.
Hi, I just wondered, how do you deal with getting them to write, apart from the exam conditions, when they have to write in such a limited space, when they've only got, again, the word count, 350 to 450 words, and trying to cram a plot in, telling them to be ambitious, but they're not overly ambitious because they can't handle Hollywood-style plots. No, and nobody on earth can handle a Hollywood plot in 350 words. So it has to be a different beast, doesn't it? And in a way, I would say 350 words, I mean, you could just model this for them by finding some really short, tiny little pieces. And I would say there's time for one move, a situation in which one thing turns, one little insight comes, one thing that changes everything gets said. Absolutely don't try to, and this was my family, and then we did this, and then that happened, because that's going to sound silly. So, I would try and have a really good few samples of tiny fragments of flash fiction, I guess. I'm hesitating to call it that, but that's what 350 words is. Just little lovely pieces. Is this too sophisticated? It depends what age group. There are some beautiful Borges parables. I mean, they are absolutely not aimed at children, but I wonder whether children wouldn't like some of them. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, and he writes these parables, and one of them that I do a lot when I'm starting my short story course, it says, in a lovely short paragraph, a man is lying dying in a shed. There's a wolf's footprint in the snow, the sun is setting, and across the fields, he can hear the Angelus ringing. He doesn't know it, but he's the last man in England who actually saw the statues of Wotan and saw... So he doesn't know it, but he's the last man who remembers the pagan religion. Now the Angelus is ringing across the field. And then there's a second paragraph which says, when each one of us dies, how many things will die with us that nobody else can remember anymore? Now it's complicated, but I don't know that isn't accessible to children. So a little twist of thought like that could work beautifully in 350 words.
Thank you. Any more questions? We've got time for one more. We've got one in the back there, sorry.
What do you do when you get stuck?
What do you do when you get stuck?
Well, the real answer is sit there and write yourself out of it. Sometimes I write at my computer. My mind is entirely adjusted to that, though I'm sure I could unlearn it, but but I have a notebook by my side that is peculiar. It's like an extra bit of my mind. So I'll also be scribbling things there. And sometimes I actually write down, why am I stuck? Those words, why am I stuck? What's the matter? What am I trying to do with this scene that I can't get at? And there's something extraordinary happens by naming it and by writing the problem down with truthfulness and clarity and saying, why am I writing this scene at all? And what's evading me? And why can't I imagine what she says? Or something like that. And it's funny that it loosens some... Stuckness is always about going too self-conscious, isn't it? And I mean, writing seems to have two energies. One of them is clever, controlling, managing, thinking as hard as you can make your head think. And the other one is dreaming. And that's the extraordinary double act you have to achieve, where these two completely opposite qualities of mind are working at once. And getting stuck tends to happen when the rigidity and the controlling is taken over and the dreaming won't be summoned. And you somehow have to loosen up. And I find that just writing what the problem is and naming it and then just playing around and actually, to go back to the minutiae, I think, see if you can find some fragments of detail in the scene and they might let you in.
Thank you. I think it's a lovely place to end, thinking about those two things working together when you write. Can I just remind you that Tessa's books, including the one she read from, Married Love and Clever Girl, are for sale in the bookshop. I think Tessa will be able to be signed copies in the bookshop after this session or later on. Now, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Tessa. Thank you to you.